Well, let's get more now. We can cross to Sir Michael Fallon, a former UK Defence Secretary who joins us from the UK. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News, Sir Michael. I just want to start, before I start talking to you about what the British Prime Minister has announced by way of this defence review, I'd like to ask for your reaction to that Ukrainian military Operation Spider's Web, the most damaging Ukrainian drone attack of the war so far. What were your thoughts when you heard about it?
It looks a stunning achievement by Ukraine, and extremely useful. It'll save lives if it stops these long-range bombers attacking and destroying civilian apartments and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Then the daring of the Ukrainian forces will really have paid off. And I hope Russia takes the right lesson from this, stops the strikes on Ukraine, and gets down to some serious peace talks.
Yeah, there were no casualties from Operation Spider's Web that we know of, and yet 41 planes were hit, billions of dollars of damage done to the Russian Air Force. Do you think there's a psychological dimension to this as well? And do you think there will be some sort of an impact on the Russian population and perhaps on morale as a result?
Well, certainly, I think the Russian population will be wondering how these explosions these bombs got through to these airfields, which are really quite remote from the front line in Ukraine. So certainly, they will feel less safe as a result. But I hope they will also understand that, these planes that have been destroyed were destroying civilian lives and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine.
Let's turn our attention to what's been happening in the United Kingdom, because we've heard Sir Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, talking about how Britain must be battle ready. Let me start by asking you about that. I mean, what does he mean when he says Britain must be battle ready?
Well, the defence review that's been published today recognises quite rightly that the main threat to the United Kingdom is now Russia. It's very clear about that. Through Russia, what Russia has done in invading Crimea and Ukraine, and before that Georgia, the attacks on our businesses, our hospitals through cyber, the menacing of our underwater cables, the incursions into near our airspace. There's no doubt now that Russia poses a threat to us here in the United Kingdom, as well as to the whole eastern frontier of NATO. And what the Prime Minister wants to do now is to wake people up to that. That means accelerating the modernisation of our defences, and it means investing in some of the long-term military equipment that we need. You've seen the announcement now about investing in new submarines, investing in more missiles.
Do you think the desire of the British Prime Minister as well is that the United States will pay attention to what the UK, a close and traditional ally of America, is doing here, especially when you single out Russia as being the biggest threat that the UK currently faces right now?
Well, certainly, what Trump is doing in America is forcing all the European members of NATO to rethink and increase the level of their defence spending. And there's a danger here for the Prime Minister, because he hasn't yet put a date on us getting to 3% of our gross domestic product, whereas some of the Baltic states, Poland, other countries have actually gone beyond that. And America itself, of course, spends well above 3%. So there's a slight danger that when Trump gets here to the NATO summit at the end of this month, Britain actually is slightly lagging the others. But the other job I think Britain has got to do, poised between Europe and the United States, is to try and convince the United States that actually all these conflicts, whether it's Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, or what Russia is doing in Ukraine, they're all linked together. And that Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China are now joining up to undermine the West and to disrupt the democracies. And really, the more we can be doing here to help Ukraine win their struggle helps the Americans, takes the load off them and helps them face up to the military growth in China.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that point you made about defence spend as a percentage of GDP. And as we've been saying, the British Prime Minister says the UK is committed to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2027, with the ambition, he says, of hitting 3% by 2034. I mean, that's a pretty long way off. And just to pick up on something that someone I'm sure you know has been saying, Lord Dannatt on Times Radio quoted as saying, that's a bit like saying in 1938 to Adolf Hitler, please don't attack us until 1946, because we're not quite ready there. I mean, do you agree with Lord Dannatt that the British government really needs to take this up a couple of gears?
Yes, I do. And, I'm very pleased they've adopted 2.5%. That was important. But it's too far away, I think, to get to 3%, particularly when other allies in Europe are spending more. And, we need to set a firmer target. And, our industry needs that as well. They need to be able to plan ahead, to start investing in the new equipment that our armed forces need. And they need to start doing that now. So it's, some of these programs are very long-term programs, and we need to make a start. And saying we've got the ambition really, isn't good enough. As Richard Dannatt said, ambition doesn't deter anybody. What does deter Russia in the end is standing up to them.
OK, so we're saying this ambition is not quite ambitious enough. You mentioned spend. There's another dimension to this, which is, of course, people. I mean, does there need to be a significant increase in recruitment in the ranks of the British military? Have they got enough manpower?
No, they haven't at the moment. Most of the army is under-recruited, and there's a serious recruitment crisis in the Royal Navy. People aren't coming forward to serve. And we need to address that. It means looking at the terms, the pay, the conditions. There's some more money going into military housing, which I welcome. But we've also, I think, got to work to bridge this gap between our civic society that has been very well protected and comfortable, if you like, since the end of the Second World War, and our military. Our military have gone off to Afghanistan, they've gone to Iraq, they've gone off to fight wars inside these big coalitions. But that's got detached, I think, from us back at home. And we've got to re-establish that link and educate, I think, people all over again, especially young people, that the military really is part of us. And all of us have an obligation, to be part of the resilience that we now want to see.
Yeah, just in terms of the language that was used by Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, he talked about war readiness. I mean, that's quite a departure from talking about deterrence, isn't it? And one of the things that was said during the course of the weekend, Germany's top defence official, General Carsten Brewer, warns of a possible Russian attack on a NATO state within the next 4 years. I mean, do you share that assessment that such an attack could be as close in time as that?
Yes, I do. And if you go to the frontline states, if you go to Romania, where I was last week, if you go to the Baltic states or Poland and you get off the plane, people say to you, welcome to the front line, because they see Russian troops massing on their border. They have Russian aircraft buzzing their aerospace overhead. And we've had direct attacks here in Britain. We had an attack in a cathedral city in Salisbury. But more than that, recently, we've had attacks on our businesses. We've had attacks on our health service, cyber attacks. Now, there's no doubt at all now that, Russia is an adversary. And we have to shake ourselves, I think, out of some complacency and remind everybody that this is a very direct threat, not just to Ukraine that's suffering, not just to Moldova or the Baltic states, but a very direct threat to us here in Western Europe and to the United Kingdom.
Do you think, what are we, 10 years almost on from Brexit, do you think a common threat and a common fear of conflicts on the European continent with Russia behind it, as you say, do you think that's somehow brought Britain closer to its European neighbours across the Channel?
Yes, I do. And so it should. This is our continent, and you can't keep relying, for example, on the Americans to come and defend us. The Second World War ended 80 years ago, and we still depend on thousands of American troops. We have to step up. And there are half a dozen members of NATO nowhere near spending the 2% at the moment, all on the western side of Europe. So Britain needs to be part of that. We should be one of the leading militaries in Europe, and we should be playing our part. And, we have that particular alliance with the United States. We have a global role as well, protecting our sea routes. We have a carrier heading for the Indo-Pacific at the moment. So it really falls on us to step up. And I think we've got to put some of the Brexit battles and the Brexit language behind us. This is our continent. And as we've had to do before, we have to step up and help defend it.
But do you not worry, Sir Michael, that, all of this expenditure on military hardware, on defence, risks somehow militarising, triggering a cycle of militarisation across Europe? And does that bring with it associated risks?
No, the European countries were spending much more on defence. As we came to the end of the Cold War, we were spending more than we're spending today at the very start of this century. No, I think we've got ourselves into a state of some complacency, that the threat isn't really here and that we don't need to get involved in this stuff. And Richard Dannard is right. We have shrunk our armed forces successively under different governments to the point where we do need to rebuild. Now, we started that a few years ago, but we certainly need to rebuild more, Army, Navy and Air Force. And we need to take the public along with us. We need to explain why we're doing this, that what is happening in Ukraine is part of what we are there to deal with, which is to defend the freedoms and democracy that we have here and to help other democracies that are under threat.
Yeah, you mentioned public opinion. There's also the public purse. There will be people asking, can the United Kingdom afford to spend so very much more on its defence? What would be your answer to that?
Well, defence just has to come first. I'm quite sure Ukraine signed up to net zero. I'm sure they'd love to be spending money on getting towards net zero. They can't do any of that stuff when they've been invaded and they're fighting Russia. So these other things, dealing with child poverty, overseas aid, getting to net zero, these are all desirable things. But the very first thing you've got to do is to defend your country and make sure you're not threatened in the way that Ukraine has been threatened.
And just lastly, we're going to wrap it up right after this question, but I just want to ask you lastly where you see things heading to from here. There have been talks taking place in Istanbul. It appears some new POW exchange has come out of that, and there'll be another round, we're being told, in June. Are you seeing any signs that perhaps there could be a way out of this that's not a military way out of this? Are you hopeful that those talks in Istanbul could yield some results?
Well, reasonably hopeful. I always thought this, couldn't be done in a day or a week or whatever President Trump said. It took a long time to end the Korean War or the Vietnam War. These things do take a long time to put together again. And obviously the first step ought to be some kind of ceasefire. But, at the moment, the President of America wants to see some sort of agreement. And I should think in the end, the Russians do want some sort of agreement. They're not winning this war. They're not losing it. They're not being pushed out of Ukraine, but they're not getting very much further. And Ukraine has demonstrated again at the weekend that it's absolutely determined to resist to the end. And, until there is a ceasefire, while civilians keep being killed in Ukraine, the West ought to keep stepping up and keep giving Ukraine the equipment it needs to help protect its citizens.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Sir Michael Fallon, former UK Defence Secretary, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tom.